Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. This video is the next in a series looking at the financial implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the global economy. And in today's episode, I want to answer the question, when will Russia run out of cash? A lot of people have been asking me that over the course of the last few months. Things are going badly in Russia. When will they run out of money? Well, obviously, Russia is quite a wealthy country. It does have a lot of reserves. So even though it's making losses on a monthly or an annual basis, that doesn't mean that it's bankrupt. A common theme that we see amongst a lot of the countries that are on the brink of bankruptcy is that they don't have any natural resources. They don't have anything that people want to buy, and therefore they've got a negative balance of trade. They're constantly paying more for their imports than they're receiving for their exports. And therefore, at some point, you run out of cash and you become bankrupt. Now, what's the situation with regards to Russia? Now, Russia obviously does have lots of natural resources. It has large amounts of oil and gas, and it's also got a variety of other commodities that people want to buy. And this is because Russia is an absolutely massive country. But having natural resources doesn't mean that you're immune to running out of cash. If you're constantly spending more than you're earning, then that means that you're having to dip into your reserves. And obviously, at some point, those reserves could run dry. So in today's video, what we're going to do is firstly look at the amount of assets that Russia had prior to the invasion, because quite a lot of their overseas assets have been frozen. They got seized by a lot of countries immediately after the invasion started. So they don't actually have access to any of those assets. And there is a debate going on as to whether or not the countries that have seized those assets should actually liquidate them and use them for other purposes. We'll then go on to have a look at the National Wealth Fund, which is basically the savings account for Russia, the rainy day account. So we'll have a look at how much they've got in there and what's been happening to that over the course of the last few months. We'll have a look at how much gold Russia owns. We'll look at its foreign exchange reserves, and then the amount of debt that the country has, because that's another way of funding your economy, is by taking on more and more debt. And again, that's a common theme with a lot of the countries who've gone bankrupt. They take on too much debt, they can't service it, and then ultimately they default on the debt and become bankrupt. We'll then go on to talk about what the year-end deficit was for 2022 and what the deficit was in January. If you follow the channel, you may have watched the recent video that I posted on January. It was the single worst month in Russia's history. A massive loss was incurred. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to how long I think the reserves that Russia currently has will last, given everything that's going on, and what the implications of all of this are for the Russian economy. So before we get started on all of that, if I could ask you for a thumbs up at some point during this video, if you're enjoying the content, please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I always include chapters, so if you haven't got time to watch everything, you can pick and choose what you'd like to see. And if you would like to support the channel, please have a look below, where you'll find links to YouTube super thanks and membership, as well as Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. And as always, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that has supported the channel. Genuinely appreciate it. This chart shows the level of Russia's reserves that were disclosed at the time that the invasion of Ukraine started. Up until the point when the war started, Russia still had good trading relations with the majority of the world, including the USA. And as a result of this, it was keeping large amounts of foreign currency in banks all across the world in its own accounts. And this is what happens in the normal course of business when you're trading with lots of different countries. You keep accounts in each country in the local currency, and that means that when you need to make a purchase, you can just do a transfer in dollars in the USA, or in yen in Japan, or in pounds in the UK, and it just keeps things very simple because you can receive payments and make payments in the local currency without having to worry about exchange rates and the movement of capital and all those sort of things. So if we look at this table, you can see that the largest single disclosed asset at the time was the gold that Russia is holding within the country. And at that point, it was estimated to be worth $127 billion. Russia is a big fan of gold. It had been building up large reserves of gold, and for security reasons, all of that gold was held in the country. The second largest asset on this chart were the foreign exchange reserves that Russia had built up in China, which equated to around $81 billion. Over the last few years, Russia and China have been building their trading relations, and China represents a huge export market from Russia's perspective. And obviously, since the war started, the focus on China has increased even further. The next largest country on the list is France, and one of the reasons for this is because of the banking relationships. Prior to the invasion, SocGen, the French bank, owned a large Russian bank, and therefore there was a strong trading relationship on the finance side of things. And at the time that the war started, Russia had around $71 billion worth of assets in France. Japan is located relatively close to the eastern border of Russia, and the two countries actually share some oil and gas facilities on the island of Sakhalin. And at the point the invasion started, Russia had around $59 billion worth of assets in Japan. Germany was previously Russia's largest customer in terms of the purchase of natural gas and oil, and at the time of the invasion, Russia had around $56 billion worth of assets in Germany. Despite the fractious relationship between Russia and the USA is next on the chart with $39 billion worth of assets, followed by the UK at $26 billion, Austria, which also had strong banking relations and also was a big customer of Russian oil and gas, had around $18 billion, and Canada had around $16 billion worth of Russian assets. Now, in terms of the colour coding on this chart, this relates to the sanctions and the freezing of assets. The light grey section on the left-hand side, which includes Russia and China, have no implications whatsoever, so there was no freezing of those assets. The red sections are all countries that have applied sanctions against Russia, and all of these countries seized the entire amount of Russian assets. So Russia lost access to all of these assets immediately following the invasion. And the darker grey sections in the middle of this chart represent all of the other countries, and there was a mixture in terms of the response from these countries. But it was estimated that following the invasion, Russia lost access to $350 billion worth of overseas assets. And all of those assets are still being held. They're still frozen. There have been some calls for them to be liquidated and for the money to be given to Ukraine to support the war effort. However, that actually hasn't happened because of the international laws against this. There isn't actually any law that allows any of the countries to legally take the assets, liquidate them, and give them to somebody else. So until the war ends and we have some form of resolution, these assets will remain frozen and are still legally owned by Russia, albeit they can't access any of them. This chart shows the value of the National Wealth Fund in Russia dating back to 2008. Now, the National Wealth Fund is essentially the piggy bank of Russia. This is the cash that Russia is holding in reserve to cover its obligations in terms of its international debt and also to fund any shortfalls in terms of the national budget. And alongside the dates, the three columns that we've got here are the value of the fund in US dollars, the value of the fund in Russian rubles, and the percentage that that fund relates to in terms of GDP. So what we can see here is that back in February 2008, the National Wealth Fund only had $32 billion in it, which equated to less than 2% of national GDP. So at that point, there was a very, very small amount in the National Wealth Fund. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that the losses that Russia incurred in the full year 2022 were actually more than the amount that Russia was holding back in 2008. So that basically wouldn't have covered them to be able to fund that deficit. If we now roll forward through the years, you can see by 2010, the fund was up to around $92 billion. And then stayed at around about $90 billion until 2014. And of course, that was the year that Russia invaded Crimea and annexed that whole area. And a number of sanctions were applied against Russia and it lost some of its trading relationships. And between 2015 and 2019, we saw a reduction in the National Wealth Fund. And by 2019, it was down to $58 billion, which at that point represented around 3.7% of GDP. However, between January 2019 and November 2021, the National Wealth Fund actually increased significantly, and by the start of November 21, it was up to around $198 billion, which at that point represented around 12% of GDP. So this was a significant bolstering of the National Wealth Fund over that period. And of course, that raises the question as to why that was done. Was Russia planning for some form of event, such as the invasion of Ukraine, when it knew that it would rely upon things like the National Wealth Fund to be able to fund unexpected falls in income? Now, if we move forward to February 2022, which was just before the invasion started, the National Wealth Fund had come back down to around $175 billion, which represented around 10% of GDP. And then by the start of January 2023, it was down to $148 billion, or around 8% of GDP. Now, we'll come on to talk about the significant losses that Russia incurred in January 2023 later in the video, but those losses will need to be funded from the National Wealth Fund. And if Russia continues to lose money through the course of 2023, we could see a significant fall in the value of this wealth fund. This chart plots Russia's gold reserves dating back to January 2020, and the scale on this chart is shown in tons. So this isn't a value chart, this is actually a weight chart. And one thing that's worth highlighting here is that the scale on the right-hand side starts at 2,292 tonnes So what looks like a major drop in the amount of gold reserves in the middle of this chart isn't really as significant as it looks at first glance, because the baseline here is 2,292. So there was a small dip, but overall Russia has had significant gold reserves throughout the course of the last 3 years. So I'm not a gold expert, and I doubt that you are either, so really what we want to know is how much are these gold reserves actually worth? Nobody's really interested in tonnage. We want to know what the deal is in terms of dollars. And to answer that question, let's have a look at the price of gold. And the scale on the left-hand side here is in dollars, and we are talking about ounces of gold. And this chart shows the movement in prices over the last 5 years. So if we look at the price of gold 5 years ago, it was trading for around $1,600 per ounce. You can see that after a brief dip in the price at the start of 2018, the price of gold rose steadily through to July 2020, when it was trading for around $2,250 per ounce. However, since that high point, it's actually come back down and is now trading for around $1,850. So higher than it was 5 years ago, but obviously less than it was around 2.5 years ago. So if we now jump back to this chart, we know that the price of gold is $1,850 per ounce. But the big question is, how many ounces are there in a ton of gold? Well, the answer to that is 32,000. So that means that 1 ton of gold is worth around $59 million. So the current level of gold that Russia's sitting on of 2,298 tons equates to a monetary value of around $139 billion. So essentially the amount of gold that Russia's holding is very similar to the amount of cash that it's holding in its national wealth fund. This chart shows the value of Russia's foreign exchange reserves over the last 12 months. Now, as with the previous chart, the scale on the right-hand side here doesn't start at zero. It actually starts at $540 billion and goes up to $620 billion. And if we look at what's happened over the course of the last 12 months, between February and September, there was a marked reduction in the amount of foreign exchange reserves. However, since September, we've seen a gradual increase back up to the current level of around $600 billion. Now that sounds like a lot. That sounds like Russia is sitting with an enormous amount of cash, which it quite clearly is. However, foreign currency reserves are not the same as national wealth fund and gold reserves. Those reserves are genuine reserves. You just leave them in the bank and you only touch them in case of emergency, when you need something. When you're talking about foreign currency reserves, this is your trading account, because Russia is doing deals all around the world all the time. So money is coming in from the sale of oil and gas and other commodities, and they're also paying things out for all of their purchases. So this is very similar to your checking account. And as with your checking account, the balance can go up and down on a daily basis. So the day after you've just been paid your salary, it looks great. You've got loads of money in your checking account. However, once you've then paid your mortgage and bought all your groceries and done all the other things that you do each month, that value might fall significantly. And the same thing applies to foreign currency accounts for countries. So this account shouldn't really be used to fund long-term losses that are occurring in the economy, because this is a trading account. The money's coming in and going out on a constant basis. This chart shows Russia's national debt between 2017 and 2023. So what this shows is that back in 2017, Russia's total debt was sitting at around $214 billion. In 2018 and 2019, that figure grew gradually. However, there was a large jump in 2020 to around $336 billion. The figure rose again to around $363 billion in 2021, increased further to $399 billion in 2022. And the national debt is currently estimated to increase to around $425 billion by the end of 2023. So what we're seeing here is a marked increase in the amount of debt that the Russian authorities are taking on. And this essentially relates to their spending. They're spending more than they're earning, and therefore the way they're funding that currently is by raising more debt. Now, obviously, the international debt markets are closed to Russia, and there was a lot of debate in 2022 as to whether or not Russia defaulted on its debt. It has around $40 billion of international bonds, which is relatively small given the size of the country. However, because of the financial sanctions, Russia was unable to actually make the interest payments. None of the financial institutions were permitted to accept the money, and the US authorities were stating that there was then a default on the debt because the money hadn't been paid. Now, the Russian authorities objected to that. They said that they'd put the money into an escrow account. It was available if the institutions wanted to take it, and therefore, from Russia's perspective, they deemed that there was no default. Now, in terms of whether whether there is or there isn't a default, this is really just a technicality. When we look at countries that have defaulted on their debt, the reason for those defaults is that they don't have the money. They can't actually afford to make the payments, and therefore they default and they have to go into some form of restructuring discussion. The reason that Russia's in this situation is obviously directly related to the war and the sanctions. So they have the money and the capacity to repay, they just don't have the ability to make the payment because the systems have been blocked. The financial results for full year 2022 for the Russian economy represented the single worst year in Russia's history, excluding the COVID pandemic, which is an anomaly. Full year income was actually up by 10% as a result of the increase in oil prices. But because expenditure was more than 25% above the full year budget as a result of all of the additional spending for the Ukraine war, the full year deficit was $47 billion. And this deficit was funded entirely by drawdowns from the National Wealth Fund. So this was obviously an unexpectedly bad outcome. However, the situation has got materially worse in January 2023. Slumping energy revenues and soaring expenditure pushed Russia's federal budget to a deficit of 1.76 trillion rubles, which is around $25 billion, in the month of January, as sanctions and the cost of Russia's military campaign in Ukraine choked the economy's prospects. Figures published by Russia's finance ministry showed that revenues were down by more than 46% to 426 billion rubles in January, compared with the same month from 2022. And this shortfall has been attributed primarily to the lower price being achieved for Russia's oil sales and also the lower volumes of natural gas exports. Non-oil and gas revenues were also 28% lower at 981 billion rubles, which is attributed to lower domestic VAT and income tax. Overall, budget revenues for January were down by over 35%, while spending was up by almost 59% to 3.1 trillion rubles, which is already more than 10% of the full-year spending plan for Russia. The Russian economy relies on income from oil and gas to fund its budget spending and has been forced to start selling international FX reserves to cover a deficit stretched by the cost of the Ukraine conflict. Now, interestingly, the Russian finance budget for 2023 is based on an average price for Russian oil of $70.10. And this compares to the oil price cap that's currently in place of $60 and the average sale price that Russia achieved in January of $49.48. So the price currently being achieved by Russia in the markets is almost 30% lower than the figure that it's budgeted for the whole of 2023. So that tells us that Russia needs to see a significant increase in that sale price, and it actually has to go above the oil price cap in order for Russia to be able to meet its budget. January's deficit already represents 60% of the whole year plan of 2.9 trillion rubles, and analysts expect the shortfall to widen to more than 5 trillion rubles if current conditions persist. So if we now look at the combined impact of what happened in 2022 and the first month of 2023, we've got a combination of a $47 billion deficit for 22, plus a $25 billion deficit for the first month of this year. That gives us a combined deficit of $72 billion. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video really to talk about the assets that Russia has, because there's been a lot of commentary and a lot of comments in my section that Russia has an infinite amount of assets. It can keep funding the war forever. It doesn't really matter what's happening in the economy. It's so rich, it doesn't care. But what I wanted to do in today's video is really dig down into the truth and look at exactly what assets they do have, and look at the current run rate for the deficit and work out exactly how long Russia could survive if it carries on at the current rates. So what we've established in today's video is that the two main reserves that Russia has are its National Wealth Fund, which is basically its savings account, its piggy bank, and its gold reserves. They are the genuine reserves of the country. The foreign exchange reserves that we looked at are really the trading account of Russia. They can't start using that capital to fund losses, because long term that will impact on their trading ability. They won't be able to keep making purchases of imports and all of the essential things that they need to keep the economy moving. So they don't really want to be dipping into the foreign exchange reserves if they can avoid it. So if we just focus on the National Wealth Fund and the gold, the National Wealth Fund is currently sitting at around about $150 billion, albeit that may be reduced given given what's happened in January. And the gold reserves are currently valued at around about $130 billion. So we've got around about $280 billion of genuine reserves that Russia can call upon to fund all of the losses from the economy. Now, if we look at what happened in 2022, we had a full year deficit of $47 billion. So based on that sort of run rate, would mean that Russia would be able to survive for at least 5 or 6 years without having any problems whatsoever. So that's obviously bad news from a geopolitical perspective because, as I mentioned before, the war in Ukraine is bad news for the global economy. It's increasing the price of a lot of commodities and it's also causing a lot of nervousness and volatility. So the best possible outcome from everyone's point of view would be some form of peace settlement that brings stability to the region and allows the economy of the world to get back on track. However, the full year results for 2022 don't really reflect what's going on right now because over the course of the last few months, we've seen the sanctions being ramped up against Russia. You may have seen in some of the other videos, we've talked about the oil price caps. So there was an oil price cap introduced for crude oil on the 5th of December, and that was followed up by another price cap on refined products, which came into effect on the 5th of February. And alongside those price caps, we've also seen the European Union, which was the biggest customer of Russia historically, bringing in a ban on the purchase of all crude oil products on the 5th of December, and they followed that up with a ban on all refined products as of the 5th of February. And as a result of all of these announcements, Russia have now come out and stated that they're cutting back their production of oil by 500,000 barrels per day. Now, that will have a direct impact on the economy of about $30 million per day, or around $11 billion per year. But there's also some knock-on impacts in terms of the impact on the Russian refinery industry, the employment within oil and gas, and also potentially some production problems when you try to cut back on the amount of oil that's coming out of the ground. So there's a number of factors going on right now. And what we've seen in January is that Russia had its worst month in history. It was the single worst performance that Russia has ever posted. And the net deficit in the month was $25 billion. Now, in terms of why that happened, there was a dramatic fall in income. So oil and gas income fell by around 45%. And at the same time as that happened, there was also a huge increase in expenditure because of the war in Ukraine. So the question is, was January just a one-off month, or could this be a trend that we see throughout the whole of 2023? Well, I think the answer to that is it possibly could be a trend because there's a lot of pressure on oil and gas revenue right now. The European Union's no longer buying it. The oil price caps are in place. And India and China really hold all of the power in terms of whether Russia achieves anything like its budget from a revenue perspective. But the other side of the coin is obviously what's going on in Ukraine. How much will Russia spend during 2023 on the military campaign? And what we're seeing at the moment is Russia have been ramping up their efforts. So they've been doubling down. They've been spending a lot more. If that continues over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, it's likely that we could see similar monthly deficits being recorded. And if Russia does start recording losses of $25 billion per month, obviously the reserves that are held in the National Wealth Fund and the gold reserves would last for less than 12 months, and that would then throw the Russian economy into a complete state of chaos. This would be an absolute collapse. This would be a bankruptcy if they do run down their reserves and spend all of that gold and all of the National Wealth Fund. Then they would only have the option of using debt. And obviously the international markets are closed to Russia. So all of that debt would have to come from the Russian people, and that would mean that the government would get itself more and more into debt and potentially then wouldn't be able to keep up those repayments, and we could see a genuine collapse. So this is obviously a worst case scenario, but I wanted to talk through the ins and outs of it, to look at the amount of reserves, to look at what's going on right now, the most current set of figures that we've got, and extrapolate that forward. And if Russia does carry on spending at the rate it's spending right now, and it sees a reduction in its income, we could see Russia running out of reserves before the end of 2023. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it interesting, useful and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me that thumbs up, and thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end.